The sound of tearing paper cut through the ballroom. Like a gunshot, 200 of New York's elite froze. And then they laughed. In the center of it all stood a young black woman. Her invitation ripped to pieces. Her dignity mocked. Flashing cameras, live streams already climbing into the tens of thousands. Phones were raised, voices sneered. Trash. Delusional. Get her out before she embarrasses us all. But what no one in that glittering hall knew, not the Harrington family, not the crowd, not even the millions watching online, was that the woman they were humiliating was the daughter of a billionaire, a man whose signature, within hours, would erase their $750 million lifeline and bring their empire crashing down. This isn't just a story of arrogance, it's a story of justice, of how one act of cruelty set off a chain reaction the world would never forget. And here, on Black Voice Matter, we tell these stories, stories that reveal the truth behind power, behind prejudice, and the moments that change everything. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The Waldorf Astoria, New York City's crown jewel of elegance. Tonight, its grand ballroom glittered like a cathedral of light. Crystal chandeliers rained gold across polished marble floors. Velvet curtains framed the stage like theater drapes. Waiters moved with perfect precision. Silver trays held champagne, bubbling under the glow of chandeliers. The air was alive with power. The kind of power you could almost feel brushing against your skin. Every guest wore their wealth like armor. Gowns shimmered with diamonds, tuxedos cut sharp against the spotlight. Names whispered, deals worth millions murmured between glasses of wine. This was not just a gala. It was a battlefield of reputation, a marketplace of status. And then she walked in. Naomi Carter, 24 years old. A black woman in a simple black dress. No glitter. No designer logos screaming for attention. Her shoes weren't Louboutin. Her clutch wasn't Chanel. But she carried herself with quiet strength. Unshakable confidence. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't shrinking. She walked as though she belonged. But in rooms like this, confidence isn't always enough. Across the ballroom, the Harrington family noticed her. Old money, Manhattan royalty, their name carved into buildings, whispered in boardrooms. They believed they didn't just attend these galas, they owned them. Evelyn Harrington, draped in diamonds, narrowed her eyes. Her son Blake smirked, phone already in hand, streaming live. Madison, his sister, laughed with her friends. Her Instagram live buzzed with comments, hearts flooding across the screen, and Charles Harrington, the patriarch, barely looked up. His phone buzzed, a deal worth $750 million, waiting for his signature tomorrow morning. But Evelyn wasn't thinking about business. She raised her glass, her voice dripping with venom. Look who wandered in. Some people really don't know their place. Blake turned his camera, his voice, smug and cruel. Folks, you're not gonna believe this. She thinks she belongs here. Madison snatched Naomi's invitation. With a grin, she tore it in half. The sound was sharp, merciless. White scraps fluttered down to the floor. Confetti at the wrong kind of party. Gasps, then laughter. Phones shot higher into the air. Comments exploded. Cringe. Kick her out. This is gold. Naomi bent down. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the torn pieces. But when she looked up, something had changed. The fear was gone. Her eyes burned steady, calm, defiant. She remembered her father's words. Wherever you go, remember this. You're not asking anyone to let you in. You're bringing value they can't measure. Her heart pounded, but her face stayed serene. Blake kept filming. Madison whispered, "This is too easy." Evelyn smiled, certain she'd reminded the room who held power here. But what none of them knew was that this quiet young woman carried a truth that could shatter their world before the night was over. Naomi straightened her back. She held the scraps of her invitation like evidence, and whispered to herself, "They think I don't belong, but soon they'll learn who really doesn't belong." The stage was set. The Harringtons thought they were putting on a show. What they didn't realize was that they had just triggered their own downfall. The laughter rose like smoke, thick and suffocating. Naomi Carter stood at the very center of it, the torn invitation in her hand. The glittering eyes of 200 strangers locked on her as if she were prey in a coliseum. The Harrington family led the charge. Evelyn Harrington. Her diamonds blazed under the chandeliers, her voice carried like a whip. Sharp, cold. "Well," she said, tilting her glass of champagne, "it seems someone wandered in from the wrong side of town." The crowd chuckled nervously. Some guests smiled to please her. Others simply wanted to belong to the moment, not realizing they were becoming part of something ugly. Blake Harrington. Phone in hand. TikTok Live already buzzing. His smirk wide and cruel. "Guys, you're not going to believe this. We got a full-on imposter. Front row at the Waldorf, dressed like she came from Target." The comments rolled in fast. "OMG, this is gold. Security, please." "How embarrassing." Blake laughed harder. He angled the camera closer to Naomi's face. "This is what delusion looks like in real time." Madison Harrington. Perfect curls, flawless makeup, gown dripping with sequins. Her Instagram Live had doubled in viewers in less than a minute. She leaned toward her followers, whispering like a gossip queen. "Second-hand embarrassment is real, guys. I swear I'm dying for her right now." She gestured toward Naomi's clutch. "Even the bag looks fake. Like, at least try harder, honey." Hearts and laughing emojis flooded the screen. The comments stung louder than the laughter in the room. Charles Harrington, the patriarch, a man who had built towers across Manhattan, who knew the value of every square inch of property. Yet tonight, he seemed smaller, distracted. His phone buzzed again and again with urgent calls from investors, but his wife's voice cut through his thoughts. "Charles," Evelyn snapped, "stop worrying about business for once. This is a social emergency." The crowd laughed, thinking it was witty. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, frowning, but said nothing. Naomi stood still. Her hands trembled, but her eyes told a different story. A storm was gathering inside her, hidden beneath calm dignity. She thought about every time she had walked into spaces like this, every sideways glance, every unspoken question. Does she belong here? It wasn't just about this night. It was about the invisible walls built around American high society. Walls of skin color, zip codes, last names, family wealth. This was exclusive society in its rawest form. The idea that luxury events were not just about charity or art or culture. They were about gatekeeping, drawing lines between us and them, defining who was worthy of sipping champagne beneath crystal chandeliers, and who was not. Sociologists call it social closure, a way the elite protect their privilege, reinforcing it not only through money, but through humiliation. Making sure anyone who dared step inside without their approval was reminded of their place. And tonight, Naomi was their chosen target. Evelyn's voice rang out again. "James," she called toward the security chief. "This is clearly a breach. Handle it before the auction starts." The crowd shifted closer. Phones hovered higher, the smell of perfume and expensive cigars mixed with something sour. Cruelty. Naomi bent down once more. Her hands collected each scrap of the torn invitation with delicate care, as though piecing together something sacred. The murmurs grew louder, the laughter sharper, but Naomi's mind drifted elsewhere, to her childhood, to her father's voice. Naomi, the world will try to shrink you. Don't let them. Walk with your head high, even if they try to drag you low. Her chest tightened, but her back straightened. A woman in the crowd whispered to her husband, "This doesn't feel right." Her words were soft, but Evelyn caught them, and Evelyn's response was sharp as glass. "Of course it's right. Standards must be maintained, otherwise anyone could just wander in." The cruelty wasn't hidden anymore. It was open, celebrated, broadcast live. This is how mob mentality works. When one powerful voice declares what is acceptable, others follow. Some join in out of fear, others out of greed, craving approval. And a few remain silent, though their silence speaks volumes. Blake leaned closer to his phone, eyes glittering. "Guys, this is history. Peak delusion right here." He panned the camera across the crowd. Faces in gowns and tuxedos smiled nervously, complicit in the spectacle. Naomi looked at them all. And in that moment, she realized, she wasn't just standing in front of the Harringtons. She was standing in front of every system that had ever told her she wasn't enough. The torn paper in her hand was more than paper. It was proof. Proof of how quickly dignity could be stripped away in a society built on appearances. The orchestra kept playing, but the music sounded hollow now, each note drowned beneath laughter and whispers. Naomi's voice, soft but steady, broke the noise. "I understand there's been some confusion about my presence here tonight." The crowd quieted for a second. Some guests blinked, caught off guard by her composure. But Madison burst out laughing. "Confusion? Oh, sweetheart, there's no confusion. You don't belong here." The comments on her live stream exploded. Facts. She should leave. This is awkward to watch. Naomi's heart hammered, but her expression remained serene. Inside, she thought, "They believe I'm an outsider, but they have no idea who they're pushing out." Judge Harold Simmons, still filming quietly from the back, whispered to himself, "This is beyond cruel. This will not end well for them." He had seen it before, in his courtroom, in his career, moments where arrogance blinded the powerful, moments where one small act of prejudice toppled entire reputations. The circle tightened. Phones glowed like predator eyes in the dim light. What started as gossip had become a performance. Naomi was the unwilling star. Blake grinned into his camera. This is what reality looks like when the dream dies. Evelyn raised her glass again. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue tonight's festivities, we must address this breach of decorum. This girl clearly doesn't understand the meaning of exclusivity." The word hung heavy. Exclusivity. For the Harringtons, it wasn't about culture or charity. It was about boundaries, about keeping certain people out. Naomi inhaled slowly. Her eyes swept across the glittering hall, the chandeliers, the velvet, the laughter, and she thought, "They see me as small, but this moment will be bigger than any of them." She clutched the scraps of her invitation tighter, her voice quiet, her presence unshaken, and the cruelty around her only grew. The humiliation reached its peak. And yet Naomi stood, calm, still, dignified. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that this night, this very act of cruelty, would ignite a fire none of them could control. And as she stood there, surrounded by laughter, she whispered words no one else could hear. "The world is watching. Let them." And indeed the world was watching. Through TikTok, through Instagram, through dozens of phones raised high. What began as a cruel spectacle was about to transform into undeniable evidence. The ballroom was no longer just a ballroom. It had become a stage, and every phone raised high was a spotlight. Naomi Carter stood at the center of it, holding scraps of paper, while 100 lenses captured her humiliation from every angle. Blake Harrington's voice cut through the noise. "Guys, look at this. This is what happens when fantasy meets reality." His TikTok live surged past 20,000 viewers in minutes. He grinned at the screen, feeding off the flood of comments. She really thought she belonged here? Peak cringe. Security needs to drag her out. He smirked wider, reading the validation like applause. For Blake, this wasn't cruelty. It was content. Madison Harrington was no different. Her Instagram live doubled, then tripled, climbing toward 40,000. Her perfectly rehearsed laugh filled the microphone. "Honestly, I can't. I'm literally dying from secondhand embarrassment." Hearts floated across her screen. Her followers laughed with her, spamming emojis, eager to join the performance. What the Harringtons didn't realize was this: the internet never forgets. And when arrogance meets live streaming, the damage spreads faster than wildfire. Naomi lifted her head. She saw not just faces in gowns and tuxedos. She saw cameras, dozens, maybe more. And for the first time, she realized this wasn't just between her and the Harringtons anymore. This was public, unstoppable, permanent. Her stomach tightened. A quiet voice inside whispered, "They're writing your story for you. Millions will see this, and you don't control a word of it." But another voice followed. "No, you don't let them define you. Not tonight." The crowd leaned in closer, phones hovering, flashes blinding, as if Naomi's pain was the headline they had all paid $10,000 a plate to watch. In another life, in another time, humiliation like this would vanish once the night was over. But in 2025, humiliation is eternal. Because the internet turns cruelty into entertainment, and entertainment into currency. Blake laughed into his phone. "Update, guys. Security still hasn't removed her. This is so painful, she really won't leave." The comment section erupted. "Kick her out. This is gold. Bro, keep streaming. Don't stop." And somewhere far beyond that ballroom, in dorm rooms, in subway stations, in living rooms across America, strangers were watching Naomi's face. Her eyes, her quiet defiance. Some laughed along, but others felt a pit in their stomach, because deep down they recognized the cruelty. This wasn't the first time social media turned arrogance into downfall. In 2018, the CEO of CrossFit tweeted a crude joke about George Floyd. The backlash was instant. Within 48 hours, he resigned. His empire collapsed not because of a boardroom decision, but because millions online demanded accountability. That same year, Starbucks faced a storm of outrage. 2 black men arrested in Philadelphia for nothing more than waiting for a friend inside a Starbucks store. A customer filmed it, posted it. The video went viral. Within days, Starbucks shut down 8,000 stores for racial bias training. Billions lost in revenue. All because of one video, one moment, one act of prejudice caught on camera. Naomi didn't know these examples were flashing through the minds of some guests, but she could feel something shifting. The silence in the corners, the way certain eyes averted, the weight of judgment beginning to turn. Not toward her, but toward the Harringtons. Judge Harold Simmons lowered his phone for a moment. He leaned toward his wife. "They don't realize what they're doing. They think this is private humiliation. But this is public record now. Evidence." His wife nodded, her lips tight. "Evidence that will outlive this night." Naomi exhaled. She let the thought settle. The world is watching, and that can cut both ways. Her humiliation could define her, or her composure could. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and let the cameras capture something the Harringtons hadn't planned. Her grace, her dignity, her refusal to break. Blake turned the camera closer. Guys, get this. She's literally pretending to stay calm. Like, hello? You've been exposed. It's over. But the comments had started to shift. Not all of them, but enough to notice. Why are you guys bullying her? This is getting uncomfortable. She's not even fighting back. Why are y'all so pressed? Madison frowned at her phone. Her smile faltered, but she quickly forced it back. Don't worry, fam. She's just trying to act tough. It's honestly pathetic. She didn't see the screen recordings piling up, the tweets already quoting her words, the hashtags forming. Naomi caught Madison's glance. For the first time, she saw something new in her eyes. Not just cruelty, but fear. Fear of losing control over the narrative. Naomi thought, yes, let them film, let them post, because the world will decide what story survives, not them. A guest whispered, too low for Evelyn Harrington to hear. This is going to blow up. They're not humiliating her. They're humiliating themselves. And indeed, that was the truth about social media. It doesn't just amplify the cruelty. It flips it, turns it back on those who created it. And once the tide turns, there's no escape. Evelyn raised her glass again, her voice loud. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not waste more time. Security, remove this trespasser at once. But the room didn't erupt in applause this time. The laughter had softened. The unease was spreading. The phones kept filming. But now they weren't just watching Naomi. They were watching the Harringtons. Every word Evelyn spoke, every smirk on Blake's lips, every fake laugh from Madison, all of it immortalized, all of it ready to go viral. Naomi's hands still clutched the scraps of her invitation. She whispered, so softly only those closest could hear. Keep filming, please. The world should see this. And with that, she reclaimed the story. Because by the end of the night, there wouldn't just be one recording. There would be dozens. 37 separate videos from 17 different angles, and together they would form the evidence that would turn the Harringtons' arrogance into their undoing. The laughter still lingered in the ballroom. But beneath it, another current flowed. A quieter current. One that didn't mock. One that watched. Not everyone was laughing. Not everyone was smiling. There were eyes in the crowd that saw more than entertainment. Eyes that recognized cruelty for what it was. Judge Harold Simmons stood near the back, 72 years old. His silver hair caught the light of the chandeliers. His posture still straight, a lifetime of courtrooms etched into his bones. He had presided over discrimination cases. He had heard testimonies filled with pain. But rarely had he seen injustice unfold so nakedly, so shamelessly, in a ballroom filled with wealth. He lifted his phone, pressed record, and whispered to himself, this isn't a party, this is evidence. His hand trembled slightly, not from age, but from anger, because Harold knew what was happening. He knew the power dynamics at play. This wasn't about an invitation. This was about drawing a line between them and her. And Harold thought, one day a jury will see this, maybe not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. A few feet away, Dr. Monica Lee gripped her wine glass too tightly. She was 45, an accomplished surgeon, a black woman who had clawed her way into spaces like this. Spaces that had never been built with her in mind. She had faced the stares, the subtle questions. Are you sure you're in the right place? Oh, you're the doctor? She knew this feeling. Too well. Her chest tightened, watching Naomi stand alone. Every cruel laugh felt like a needle, every comment like a wound. Part of her wanted to step forward, to stand beside Naomi. But another part froze. The voice in her head whispered, "Be careful. Don't risk your reputation. Don't draw their fire onto you." That fear was real, because Monica knew what happened when black professionals spoke up in rooms like this. They were labeled angry, unprofessional, too much. Her silence burned. It felt like betrayal, but her phone was in her hand, and without even realizing, she pressed record. If she couldn't speak in the moment, at least she could make sure the truth survived it. Andrew Mitchell stood near the bar, a man in his 50s, a self-made entrepreneur, not born into wealth. He had built it. And because of that, he understood what humiliation felt like. He knew the sting of being overlooked, dismissed, talked over by men who had inherited fortunes. So when he saw Naomi clutching scraps of paper while the Harringtons laughed, something inside him twisted. He didn't laugh, he didn't clap, he didn't smile. Instead, he slid his phone from his pocket and quietly began to film, not for fame, not for clout, but because instinct told him, this moment matters, and it must not vanish. 3 witnesses, 3 phones, 3 silent acts of resistance. None of them shouted, none of them intervened, but in their own way they refused to let the truth be buried. Because in America silence has always been complicated. Sometimes silence means safety. Sometimes silence means complicity. But now, in the age of smartphones, silence can mean something else. Silence can be transformed into proof. Think of the George Floyd video, 9 minutes and 29 seconds that shook the world. The bystanders didn't stop the officer. They couldn't. But their phones turned silence into a weapon, into evidence, into a movement. Or think of the Central Park bird-watching incident. A white woman, Amy Cooper, called the police on a black man for nothing more than asking her to leash her dog. If that moment hadn't been filmed, it would have been her word against his. Instead, the world saw the truth. Her life unraveled, his dignity preserved. Smartphones had changed the rules. The gatekeepers no longer controlled the narrative. The witnesses did. Back in the ballroom, Naomi could feel the eyes on her. Some mocking, some complicit, but some different. She noticed Harold's steady gaze, the way his phone pointed toward her, not away. She noticed Monica, her jaw clenched, her eyes heavy with unspoken solidarity. She noticed Andrew, quiet in the corner, phone in hand, recording like a man capturing history. And for the first time that night, Naomi felt something other than isolation. She felt watched, not by enemies, but by allies, silent ones. Her heart steadied, her breathing slowed. She whispered to herself, "They are not all against me." Meanwhile, Evelyn Harrington still reveled in her performance. Blake still smiled at his followers. Madison still fed her live stream. They believed the silence in the room was consent. They believed the lack of confrontation meant victory. But they didn't see the phones. They didn't realize their cruelty was being documented from every angle. Naomi held her chin higher, not defiant, not mocking, just steady. Her dignity stood in contrast to their arrogance, and silently, evidence was piling up. Judge Simmons thought, "If this were my courtroom, I'd call it textbook harassment." Monica thought, "If this were my hospital, I'd call it malpractice of humanity." Andrew thought, "If this were my boardroom, I'd call it self-destruction." Each silent witness carried the weight of truth. Each silent witness knew this night would not end here, because silence in that ballroom was no longer complicity. It was strategy. It was resistance. It was record-keeping. The orchestra played on. The lights glittered. But beneath it all, history was being written. not by the Harringtons, but by the witnesses. And soon those silent recordings, those fragments of truth, would collide with power. Because before the night was over, Naomi would make a single phone call, a call that would bring the weight of a billionaire into the ballroom and turn silence into thunder. The ballroom still buzzed with whispers. Phones hovered. The Harringtons smiled, certain they had won, but Naomi Carter stood perfectly still, a torn invitation in one hand, her phone in the other. And then she dialed. The sound was soft, a single ring, cutting through the noise of crystal glasses and murmured laughter. Then another, and another. By the third ring, the ballroom had grown quiet. Curiosity edged into the silence. 200 people leaning closer, every ear straining. And then a voice answered. Naomi. The voice was deep, steady, unmistakable. It carried the authority of boardrooms, of Wall Street, of Silicon Valley. Yes, Dad, Naomi replied, her voice calm, deliberate. I'm still here, at the Waldorf, at the Harrington's Gala. Every head turned. Every phone camera zoomed closer. Evelyn Harrington's smile faltered. Blake lowered his phone for the first time all night. Madison's eyes darted nervously towards the crowd, because they had all heard the name. Carter. Naomi's voice didn't tremble. Dad, I thought you should know what the Harrington family really thinks of people like us. They tore up our foundation's invitation, called me trash, said I didn't belong here. The words echoed across the marble walls. Sharp, clear, a public indictment disguised as a daughter's call. Dr. Monica Lee gasped softly. Judge Simmons' hand tightened around his phone. Andrew Mitchell whispered, almost in awe, "She's not just fighting back, she's detonating." On the other end of the line, David Carter's voice carried through the speaker. Calm, measured, but filled with steel. Naomi, stay exactly where you are. Do not move. I'll handle this. The room froze. The words sank in. Every guest felt it. The shift. The unraveling. David Carter. Founder and CEO of Carter Dynamics, a $60 billion tech empire, one of the richest men in America, a billionaire philanthropist whose name adorned universities, hospitals, and museums, a man with the power to crush fortunes with a single phone call. And Naomi was his daughter. The whispers spread like wildfire. Oh my God, Carter. As in Carter Dynamics? Her dad's worth $13 billion. Phones lit up. Guests Googled, desperate to confirm. And there it was. David Carter's face. Forbes covers. Headlines about billion-dollar innovations. Stories about his philanthropy in underserved black communities. The Harringtons' faces drained of color. Charles Harrington's phone buzzed violently, his screen lit with a name. David Carter. The man he was scheduled to meet at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. The man whose $750 million partnership was the only thing keeping Harrington Global afloat. His hand shook. He didn't answer, because there are no words for that kind of mistake. Naomi turned slowly, letting her gaze sweep the crowd, her voice steady. They called me worthless trash. They laughed as they tore up our foundation's invitation, the same foundation that gave $100,000 to tonight's event. Gasps rippled. Heads turned away from the Harringtons. The balance of power shifted in real time. Blake fumbled with his phone, his live stream still running, hundreds of thousands of viewers now flooding his comments. Wait, that's Carter's daughter. Dude, you're finished. Best plot twist ever. His smirk evaporated. Panic replaced arrogance. Evelyn's voice cracked. This is a misunderstanding. She should have said who she was. But even she knew it was too late, because everyone understood the truth. They hadn't humiliated Naomi Carter because she wasn't invited. They humiliated her because they believed she didn't belong. And in America, that story runs deep. It's called code switching, the constant shifting between identities. The way black professionals, even the wealthy, adapt their speech, dress, or behavior just to be accepted. Naomi had lived it her whole life, told to tone it down, told she was too loud, told she didn't look like someone who came from wealth. Even with billions behind her name, suspicion followed. Because in elite white spaces, money doesn't erase prejudice. Think of Sasha and Malia Obama, daughters of a US president, raised in the White House. And still, when they attended parties in college, people questioned if they belonged. Security questioned their IDs. Classmates whispered judgments not about who they were, but about the color of their skin. Or think of Meghan Markle, married into the British royal family, yet still subjected to relentless questioning of her worth, her heritage, her very right to stand where others stood without challenge. Wealth, fame, power, none of it shielded them from prejudice. Because the question of belonging was never about merit, it was about appearance, it was about skin. Naomi felt that weight now, the irony, that she, the daughter of one of the richest men in America, was being treated like an intruder at a gala her own foundation had sponsored. Her lips pressed into a thin line. But her eyes held fire. She thought, "This is exactly what Dad warned me about, that no matter how high we climb, some will always look down." The room remained frozen. Evelyn clutched her pearls, speechless. Blake looked pale, scrolling frantically, watching his follower count implode. Madison ended her live stream mid-sentence, her face ghost white. And Naomi? She stood taller. Her humiliation had transformed into revelation. The silence broke when Judge Simmons' voice rang out, low but firm. "As someone who has seen a lifetime of injustice, I can say with certainty, tonight will be remembered." All eyes turned to him. A judge, a witness, a man with credibility that could not be dismissed. His words were less about prediction and more about warning. Dr. Monica Lee added softly, almost trembling with restrained anger, "She stood with dignity while you tore her down, and now the whole world is seeing you for what you are." Her words hung heavy, not shouted, not dramatic, but undeniable. The Harrington family stood in silence. The predators had become prey, and the ballroom, once filled with laughter, now held only shame. Naomi lowered her phone, ending the call. She slipped it into her clutch, her voice soft, almost serene. "Thank you, Dad. I'll see you soon." The message was clear. He was coming. And with him, a reckoning. The Harringtons thought the night had reached its climax. But they were wrong. Because David Carter was already on his way to the Waldorf. And when he walked through those doors, silence would turn into judgment, and judgment into consequence. The grand doors of the Waldorf Astoria opened with a thunderous echo, the kind of sound that silences a room, the kind of sound that announces more than an arrival. It announces a reckoning. And there he was, David Carter, 6'2", impeccable in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, flanked by 2 attorneys, an assistant with a tablet, and a calm that was more intimidating than rage. The crowd parted instantly, like water cut by a ship's bow. Every whisper died. Every phone lowered, then slowly raised again, because no one wanted to miss this moment. Naomi exhaled, relief mixing with determination. Her father's eyes met hers. "Are you all right?" She nodded once. "I'm fine, just educated." His jaw tightened. Then his gaze shifted, cold and sharp, to the Harrington family. Evelyn Harrington, who had sneered minutes earlier, now stood rigid, diamonds trembling at her throat. Blake's phone slipped in his sweaty hands. Madison clutched her purse like a shield. And Charles looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him, because he knew something the others didn't. He knew exactly how fragile Harrington Global was, and he knew David Carter held the key to their survival. David's voice carried across the hall, low, controlled. Charles, Evelyn, Blake, Madison. Each name spoken like a charge in an indictment. I received a call from my daughter tonight. She told me about your family's definition of exclusivity. Silence. Not a sound in the ballroom. Even the orchestra had stopped mid-note. David's assistant tapped her tablet. Numbers glowed on the screen. She handed it to him. He spoke again. Let's review the facts. Harrington Global. Current debt, $1.2 billion. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Quarterly losses, $89 million. Stock price down 73% this year. The Harringtons froze. Private financial wounds laid bare for 200 guests and tens of thousands online. David stepped forward. Tomorrow morning, you were scheduled to sign a $750 million partnership with Carter Dynamics. That deal would have kept your company alive. Now. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. That deal is under review. Charles's face turned ashen. Evelyn's hand clutched his arm, nails digging deep. Blake whispered, panicked. Dad, please say something. But Charles's voice cracked. David, this is a misunderstanding. David cut him off. No, this is arrogance. This is cruelty disguised as class. The crowd murmured. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. The performance had flipped. The Harringtons were no longer the hosts. They were defendants in a trial they didn't see coming. And David wasn't finished. Business isn't just numbers. In America, business is ethics. Your actions reveal your brand, your values, and values are currency. He turned toward the audience. You've seen it before. You know what I mean. His assistant spoke crisply, reading from her notes. Nike 2018. They backed Colin Kaepernick after he knelt during the anthem. Critics burned shoes on YouTube. Stock dropped in the first days. But within a month, sales soared. Nike gained $6 billion in value because they chose a side, and the public rewarded them. Another slide. H&M 2018. A black child in a hoodie labeled coolest monkey in the jungle. Outrage was instant. Celebrities cut ties. Stores were vandalized. Stock plummeted. Because racism once seen cannot be unseen, and silence is complicity. David let the words hang. Every guest knew the truth of them. Every phone streamed his voice into living rooms around the world. This isn't just about a torn invitation. It's about who you are when you think no one important is watching. And tonight, the world was watching. Evelyn's lips trembled. Her confidence shattered. She whispered, desperate. Please, David. We had no idea she was your daughter. His eyes narrowed. That's the problem. You didn't need to know. You only needed to know she was human. The line struck like lightning. The crowd inhaled sharply. Phones shook in hands. Even Judge Simmons lowered his, stunned by the weight of those words. Blake muttered into his phone, forgetting the live stream was still running. I didn't mean, I was just making content. But the comments destroyed him. Content? You humiliated a billionaire's daughter for likes? This is career suicide. Keep streaming. This is history. His hands shook. He ended the live, too late. Hundreds of thousands had seen his downfall unfold in real time. Charles tried again. David, let's talk privately. Please, don't do this here. But David's voice cut sharper. No, Charles, transparency. You made my daughter's humiliation public. Now your accountability will be public too." The crowd nodded, some in agreement, some in awe, because this was no longer just a gala. It was a courtroom, and David Carter was the judge. Naomi stood silent, watching. She saw fear in the Harringtons' eyes, but she also saw something else. Recognition. They finally understood the depth of their mistake. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself a breath of satisfaction. Not revenge, but justice. David's final words landed like a verdict. "Charles, you should have remembered this. Reputation is capital. Values are capital, and you've just bankrupted yours." The ballroom erupted, not with applause, not with laughter, but with silence so deep it felt holy. Transition to Chapter 6. But this was only the beginning, because the evidence wasn't just in David's words, it was in the videos, the live streams, the screenshots flooding social media. And as the Harringtons would soon learn, what happens online does not stay online. It destroys empires. The ballroom felt less like a gala now, more like a courtroom. And the witnesses? Not just the 200 guests in designer gowns, but millions, watching through their phones. David Carter raised his hand. His lead attorney stepped forward. A woman in her 40s. Sharp suit. Calm presence. The kind of calm that meant she knew she carried the killing blow. She spoke clearly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is already public. Allow me to summarize." She tapped the tablet. A screen lit up behind her, projected for all to see. Numbers glowed like verdicts. TikTok, Blake Harrington, 4 separate live stream clips, combined viewership as of this moment, 347,000 views. Comments include direct quotes, trash, delusional, and calls to remove Ms. Carter from civilized society. Blake's knees buckled, the comments still climbing on the side of the screen. This is the end for him. Family ruined. Instagram, Madison Harrington, live broadcast to 43,000 followers. Duration, 37 minutes. Content, humiliation, mockery, and encouragement of a crowd to laugh at Ms. Carter's presence. Screenshots already circulating across Twitter. Trending hashtags include #Trashgate and #Justice for Naomi. Madison's face went white. Her phone buzzed with angry DMs, her influencer career dissolving in real time. The lawyer's voice sharpened. Security footage, museum photographers, 37 separate video recordings, 17 different angles, every one of them showing the Harrington family tearing up the invitation, mocking Ms. Carter, and calling for her removal. Silence. You could hear the breathing of the Harringtons, shallow, uneven. Then came the final blow. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is no longer a private embarrassment. This is a national spectacle. As of this moment, over 12.8 million Americans have seen at least one clip of tonight's incident." Gasps filled the room. Some covered their mouths, others shook their heads in disbelief. Charles Harrington swayed. His empire, his legacy, unraveling not in boardrooms, but in comment sections. Naomi closed her eyes for a second. Let the weight of it wash over her. Her humiliation, broadcast live, had become her vindication. The very phones that once felt like weapons had transformed into shields. She thought, the whole country sees. They know the truth. I don't have to shout. The evidence speaks louder than I ever could. The lawyer turned to the crowd. Some may call this cruel, but in America, accountability often begins here, online. It's called cancel culture. The words cut across the room. Cancel culture. The phenomenon where a career, a fortune, a legacy can collapse in days, sometimes in hours, because the internet doesn't forgive, and it never forgets. She continued. Take Roseanne Barr, One racist tweet. ABC cancelled her top-rated show within 24 hours. Her decades-long career, gone. Or Shane Gillis, announced as a new Saturday Night Live cast member. Within days, clips surfaced of him mocking Asians. NBC fired him before he even stepped on stage. Or Paula Deen. A single deposition revealed racist language. Within weeks, she lost sponsors, book deals, restaurants, a multi-million-dollar empire. Gone. The lawyer paused. Some say it's unfair. Some say it's mob justice. But the truth is this. In a society built on image, perception is power. And once the public sees prejudice, they demand accountability. She looked directly at the Harrington family. Tonight, you provided the evidence yourselves. Blake wanted to shout, to argue, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew, everyone knew, the internet had already judged him. Madison wiped tears from her eyes, whispering to no one. My sponsors, my deals, they'll all cut me. Evelyn clutched her pearls. This is a witch hunt. She whispered, but even she didn't believe it. And Charles? He simply stared into the distance, calculating, wondering how many hours until investors called, until stocks fell, until the Harrington name was poison in every headline. Naomi opened her eyes. She didn't smile, but her gaze was unflinching. For years she had been told to code switch, to soften her voice, to fit in, to make herself small. But tonight proved something else. That dignity, when tested, could stand taller than cruelty. She thought, they tried to erase me. Now the whole world knows my name. The lawyer closed her tablet. The Harrington family built their brand on exclusivity. But tonight they revealed what that truly means. Exclusion. And America is watching. The silence was deafening. Not a sound except the faint buzz of phones. Phones that were now less entertainment and more evidence. Judge Simmons cleared his throat. In my courtroom, I've seen careers destroyed by prejudice, but never have I seen a family destroy themselves so completely, in real time. Dr. Monica Lee whispered to her husband, This isn't just justice. This is history. Andrew Mitchell folded his arms, his eyes on the Harringtons. They'll never recover. Not from this. Not in this country. Not in this era. Because in America today, the line between public image and survival is thin. Companies, families, celebrities, all live and die by reputation. And reputation lives online. Nike thrived because it chose values over comfort. H&M stumbled because it chose carelessness over respect. And now the Harringtons faced the same choice, not in a boardroom, not in private, but in front of millions. Naomi felt her phone buzz. Texts poured in from friends, colleagues, strangers. Some said, "Proud of you." Others, "We're watching. We stand with you." For the first time all night, tears pricked her eyes. Not from pain, but from validation, from knowing that her silence, her composure, had become louder than any insult. The lawyer's final words sealed the moment. This is the age we live in. Accountability is no longer optional, it is demanded. And the Harringtons will answer. But as powerful as the videos were, as devastating as the numbers became, the true test was yet to come, because evidence alone doesn't end empires. It takes consequences. And those consequences were about to arrive. The ballroom had become a battlefield, not of swords, but of words, of evidence, of silence that cut deeper than steel. The Harringtons stood pale, trembling, drowning in the tidal wave of their own arrogance. But then, Naomi stepped forward. She wasn't angry, she wasn't shouting. Her voice was calm, measured, almost merciful. "Enough," she said. The word floated above the marble floors, heavier than Evelyn's diamonds, sharper than Blake's live stream, stronger than Charles's trembling excuses. Naomi looked directly at them. You wanted exclusivity. Tonight, you got it. You've been exposed before the world. But here's the truth. You don't have to end here. You can choose a different ending. The crowd shifted. Whispers rose. Because no one expected this. Not forgiveness. Not from the girl they had humiliated. Naomi continued. I don't believe in destruction for the sake of destruction. I believe in transformation. So I'm giving you one chance, a final chance, not to save your pride, but to save your people, your company, your legacy. Her words landed like a gavel. The Harringtons clung to them like drowning men reaching for a rope. She laid out the terms. Clear, uncompromising. 1. A public apology. Tonight, in front of every guest, every phone, every live stream, you will admit what you did. You will call it what it was, prejudice, cruelty, and you will ask forgiveness, not just from me, but from everyone watching. The room buzzed. Some gasped, some nodded. Naomi's voice grew steadier. 2. A fund, $15 million, dedicated to scholarships for underprivileged students, programs for young entrepreneurs, and opportunities for communities you've ignored for decades. Blake's eyes widened. 15 million? Naomi didn't blink. Yes, 15. Anything less is just a press release. I want commitment, not charity. 3. Her voice sharpened. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, your board, your executives, your hiring, all of it audited, monitored, and reformed, mandatory training, independent oversight. Because change cannot be words, it must be built into the bones of your company. The room erupted. Phones buzzed with comments, some praising, some shocked, but all riveted. Charles Harrington's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, but never had he felt more powerless. Evelyn's face flushed red. Public humiliation isn't reform, it's revenge. Naomi turned her gaze on her. Revenge would be silence. Revenge would be letting you destroy yourselves without lifting a finger. This isn't revenge. This is mercy. The words hit harder than any insult. Even Evelyn couldn't respond. David Carter folded his arms. He said nothing, because he knew. This wasn't his battle. This was his daughter's. And tonight, Naomi Carter was writing the verdict. The crowd leaned forward. Because beneath the spectacle, they felt something deeper. This wasn't just about one family. This was about corporate America. Naomi's demands weren't radical. They were inevitable. Across the country, companies had begun the same journey. Google, after backlash in 2020, pledged $175 million to support racial equity and increase black representation in leadership. Meta launched internal programs to confront bias in algorithms, hiring practices, and executive ranks. Microsoft tied executive bonuses directly to progress in diversity goals. These weren't acts of charity. They were acts of survival. Because in modern America, DEI isn't optional, it's a requirement. Naomi spoke it aloud. Diversity isn't weakness, it's strength. Equity isn't charity, it's justice. Inclusion isn't kindness, it's necessity. And if you don't understand that, your company won't survive the next decade. Judge Simmons whispered to himself, spoken like a closing argument. The Harringtons stared at her. Blake's lips trembled. I didn't mean... Naomi cut him off. You meant every word. You broadcast it. You turned cruelty into content. Now you will use that same voice, that same platform to make amends. Madison whispered, my followers will never forgive me. Naomi's eyes softened. Then earn new ones, Not through luxury posts, through honesty, through humility. Charles finally spoke, his voice broken. What if we refuse? Naomi's gaze turned ice. Then your company dies, within 67 days. That's how long your liquidity lasts without Carter dynamics. And when your employees ask why they lost their jobs, you can tell them the truth. That you threw it all away because you couldn't treat one black woman with respect. The silence was thunder. The guests inhaled sharply. Because they knew. She was right. Evelyn's hand shook as she held her glass. Her empire of diamonds felt suddenly worthless. She whispered, almost to herself, "What have we done?" Naomi didn't answer, because the answer was already written across every phone screen in the room. The lawyer stepped forward again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the new language of power. Not just dollars, not just contracts, but accountability. And tonight, the Harrington family must decide redemption or ruin." The ballroom waited, every camera live, every witness silent. The Harringtons stood on the edge of their future. Shame weighed them down. But Naomi had left the door open. A door to mercy. A door to change. A door they had never imagined they would need. Naomi whispered one last line. "Choose wisely, because tonight the world is watching." And the world truly was, because by dawn the clips of Naomi's ultimatum would flood every timeline, every headline, every late-night monologue. The question wasn't just whether the Harringtons would change, it was whether corporate America would finally understand that dignity had become the new currency of power. 6 months had passed. New York still glittered, but inside the Waldorf Astoria, the atmosphere felt different. No champagne towers, no diamond gowns, no orchestra playing for the wealthy elite. Instead, the chandeliers lit up a stage. Above it, a banner stretched wide. The Harrington Carter Responsibility Summit. Every seat was filled. CEOs, professors, journalists, activists, cameras from CNN, CNBC, Bloomberg pointed toward the podium. People hadn't forgotten that night. The night the Harringtons were exposed before the world. But tonight, they weren't here to watch arrogance collapse. They came to see if change was possible. Evelyn Harrington walked to the microphone first. No diamonds, no silk. A simple navy dress. Her hair pulled back. Her face bare of makeup. Her voice was low. Steady. 6 months ago, I humiliated a young woman. I told myself I was protecting standards, but I was really protecting prejudice. I tore up her invitation. But what I really tore was the thin veil that covered my own blindness. The room was silent, not judgmental, but listening. Blake stepped forward next. No phone in his hand, no TikTok Live, just a notepad he gripped with nervous fingers. 6 months ago, he said, I thought content was everything. I filmed humiliation for laughs, for likes, for numbers that meant nothing. But when my own face became the content, when the world saw my cruelty, I realized content can destroy, or it can heal. I chose to let it heal. On the screen behind him, new clips appeared. Blake interviewing scholarship students, explaining DEI to Gen Z followers, working with non-profits. His followers had dropped, but his impact had grown. Authenticity, he said softly, lasts longer than arrogance. Madison's turn. Once she had been the face of luxury, designer bags, resorts, sports cars. Now the screen showed different images. Madison teaching English to immigrant women, hosting community events on bullying prevention, speaking at a Women in Business forum. Her voice carried no vanity, only humility. I thought influence was about envy. Now I know it's about responsibility. And if I once used 43,000 followers to broadcast cruelty, Today I use that same platform to amplify justice." The family stood together, not as the rulers of a ballroom, but as proof that shame can be a beginning, not an end. And then Naomi Carter took the stage. The audience rose to their feet. Applause thundered. Her presence was different now, no longer the girl clutching torn paper, but a woman who had turned humiliation into history. She smiled gently. "The Harrington family is not perfect. None of us are. But they chose to change. They invested not in diamonds, not in image, but in dignity." Naomi's tone deepened. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. In American business today, those aren't slogans. They're infrastructure. They decide whether a company survives the next decade. She spoke of Google investing millions into black entrepreneurs, Meta forcing its algorithms to confront bias, Microsoft tying executive bonuses to diversity progress. "These aren't acts of charity," she said. "They're strategy, they're survival." Her words carried weight, because everyone in the room knew it was true. Markets now cared about values as much as profits, and brands lived or died by their ethics. Naomi glanced at Blake and Madison. "Some are born with everything, but privilege is not destiny. It's a choice." She reminded the room of history. Kennedys who chose public service. Bush family members who served in the military. America has seen rich kids take the harder road. The Harringtons have chosen to walk it too. Evelyn sat quietly, replaying Naomi's words in her mind. Mercy, not revenge. Blake scribbled in his notebook. "I used to chase views. Now I chase impact." Madison held the hand of a young girl who had received a scholarship from the new $15 million fund. The girl's eyes shone, and Madison realized this moment was worth more than any private jet photo. The audience whispered. 6 months ago, I thought the Harringtons were finished." "Maybe this is just the beginning." On Twitter, hashtags exploded. Responsibility Summit. One post went viral. "Redemption arcs aren't fiction. Tonight I saw one live." The summit ended with standing applause. Naomi stood beside her father, David Carter, looking out at the crowd. David leaned toward her. "You turned their collapse into a classroom. You gave them mercy. But the real question is, will America listen?" Naomi's gaze lifted toward the New York skyline. Her eyes weren't fixed on the Harringtons anymore. They were on something larger, the companies, the institutions, the next doors that needed to be opened. Because she knew the biggest battle had only just begun. 6 months after the Responsibility Summit, Naomi Carter stood at the podium of Harvard Business School. The same girl who had once been mocked in a ballroom now faced an audience of future CEOs, investors, and policymakers. The lecture hall was silent. Not the silence of boredom, the silence of anticipation. Naomi spoke with calm conviction. 6 months ago, I wasn't on a stage. I was on the marble floor of the Waldorf Astoria, picking up scraps of paper from a torn invitation. People laughed. They live-streamed my humiliation to thousands. And in that moment, I thought I was alone. But I wasn't. Because 200 phones recorded not just my shame, but the arrogance of those who caused it. And that night became proof. Proof that prejudice, when exposed, cannot hide in the shadows anymore. She paused, letting the words settle. Dozens of students leaned forward. Some recorded on their laptops. Others simply stared, wide-eyed. Naomi continued. That night was supposed to be my breaking point. Instead, it became a beginning. Because when truth is seen, it can't be unseen. And when one person stands, others rise too. After Harvard, the requests multiplied. Stanford, Wharton, Yale. Then, an invitation far larger, the United Nations. When Naomi arrived in Geneva, the UN Assembly Hall shimmered with flags from 193 nations. Delegates sat beneath the iconic UN emblem, headphones ready for translation. But for Naomi, no translation was needed. The language of dignity was universal. She began softly. 2 years ago, I was humiliated in a room full of wealth and power. My invitation was torn, my presence ridiculed, and for a moment I believed my dignity had been stolen. But dignity is not given by others, and it cannot be taken. It is a choice to stand when others push you down. Her voice grew stronger. That night I realized something. A personal wound can ignite a public movement. History is filled with moments just like this. She named them. Rosa Parks, a seamstress in Montgomery who simply refused to give up her bus seat. A personal act of defiance that sparked the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a preacher from Atlanta whose voice turned marches into a dream the world still remembers. And more recently, Black Lives Matter. Born from the grief of lives lost, yet transformed into a global demand for justice. Naomi looked across the sea of delegates. My humiliation at a gala was not on the scale of those tragedies, but it carried the same lesson. That injustice, no matter how small or personal, reveals the cracks in our systems. And if exposed, it can force change far larger than the moment itself. The audience listened, transfixed. Her words weren't fiery like King's sermons. They weren't bitter like a wound left open. They were steady, measured, hopeful, because she wasn't just condemning the past, she was offering a blueprint for the future. Naomi held up a sheet of paper, a replica of the torn invitation. "This," she said, "was once meant to exclude me. Now I keep it as a reminder. That exclusion can be transformed into inclusion, that shame can become testimony, that silence can become evidence." The hall erupted in applause. Not polite applause, but thunderous, prolonged, unified. Later, CNN would call her speech a turning point in corporate ethics. The New York Times described her as the new face of global accountability. And on social media, clips of her holding the torn invitation trended worldwide. Naomi Carter had become more than a survivor of humiliation. She had become a symbol, a reminder that business is no longer just about profit. It is about people. It is about dignity. It is about justice. And inside, Naomi felt the weight of it. She never asked to be a symbol. She never wanted to carry a movement on her shoulders. But as she walked off the UN stage, greeted by world leaders, students, activists, she whispered to herself, "If not me, then who? If not now, then when?" The lesson was clear. One moment of cruelty in a ballroom, one young woman's refusal to break, and suddenly an entire world was watching. Because history often begins this way, not with speeches carefully planned, but with moments no one could plan. A torn invitation, a bus seat refused, a protest sign lifted in grief. Small acts, personal acts, that ripple outward until the ripples become waves. And Naomi knew the wave had only begun to rise. The question now was whether companies, governments, and communities would ride it toward justice, or drown beneath it. 6 months after the United Nations speech, the Harrington family appeared again. This time, not in scandal, but as proof that even the most public villains can choose redemption. Evelyn Harrington now walked into conferences without diamonds. She carried notebooks instead of clutches. Her schedule was filled not with galas, but with community center meetings. Reporters once asked her, "Why the change?" She answered quietly, "Because silence is comfortable, but silence builds nothing. Service does." Blake no longer measured his worth in views. He deleted the old accounts that once turned cruelty into comedy. In their place, he built a platform called Impact Voices, a TikTok and YouTube series highlighting underrepresented entrepreneurs, students, and activists. His first viral video wasn't a prank. It was an interview with a scholarship student who said through tears, "I am the first in my family to go to college, and the Harrington Carter Fund made it possible." The comments flooded in. This is the content we need. From arrogance to advocacy, that's growth. Madison, once the face of luxury Instagram, shifted her lens entirely. Her feed now showed no yachts, no champagne, no private jets. Instead, photos of her teaching art classes in underserved schools, videos of her leading fundraising campaigns for shelters. A caption read, "6 months ago, I used my platform to amplify humiliation. Now I use it to amplify hope." And for the first time, her followers weren't envying her. They were learning from her, joining her. This transformation didn't erase the past, but it reframed it. The Harringtons became an unlikely redemption arc, a case study taught in classrooms, whispered about in boardrooms. Professors used them as examples. How does a family go from disgrace to leadership? The answer was simple: by facing the mirror, by not running from the consequences, by building change that was measurable, not cosmetic. And at the center of it all, Naomi Carter. She no longer stood as the girl who once clutched a torn invitation. She now held a title, Vice President of Social Impact at Carter Dynamics. Her office wasn't in the highest tower. She chose a floor close to the foundation's outreach department. Her daily work wasn't just approving grants. It was visiting schools, meeting small business owners, listening to employees at every level. Because for Naomi, social impact wasn't a line in a corporate report. It was personal. One day, a journalist asked her, "What's it like being the daughter of one of the richest men in America?" She smiled gently. "Money can build buildings, but money doesn't build trust. Money can open doors, but money doesn't guarantee respect. The real power," she said, "is how you treat people when they are at their weakest, because that is the moment they will always remember." Her words spread like wildfire, quoted on LinkedIn posts, painted on protest signs, printed on the cover of Fortune magazine. True power isn't wealth, it's dignity. The Harrington story, once a tale of scandal, became a parable. Business schools analyzed it, churches preached about it, activists referenced it. It joined the long history of American lessons. That arrogance collapses, that cruelty consumes itself, and that dignity, once chosen, creates legacies. In classrooms, professors linked Naomi's story to others. Rosa Parks refusing to move, MLK demanding justice with a dream, the Black Lives Matter movement turning grief into policy debates and reforms. Each began as a moment. Each became a movement. Naomi's humiliation at the Waldorf Astoria. It had become a modern reminder that injustice, when exposed, can't be ignored. Judge Harold Simmons once said it best during an interview. "I thought I was just pressing record on my phone. Turns out I was pressing record on history." The Harringtons still carried their scars. There were jokes, online memes, reminders of who they once were. But they didn't run from it. They embraced it. Evelyn opened every keynote with the same line. You've probably seen the video. Yes, that was me, and yes, I was wrong. The honesty disarmed critics, because redemption only works when confession comes first. For Naomi, the journey carried a heavier weight. Every boardroom she entered, every speech she gave, carried echoes of that night. But instead of shame, she carried it like a banner, a reminder, a compass, because she knew her story wasn't about a billionaire's daughter. It was about every person who had ever been told, "You don't belong." And it was about answering back, not with anger, but with unshakable dignity. She closed her first annual Carter Dynamics Social Impact Report with a line that circled the world. Power is not measured by dollars, not by deals, not by diamonds. Real power is revealed in how you treat people when they stand before you with nothing. The report went viral, printed in Time, quoted in speeches by senators, shared by CEOs on LinkedIn who once never thought twice about DEI. Naomi had turned humiliation into a global standard. And now, to the audience beyond the boardrooms, beyond the screens, beyond the classrooms, her voice carried outward. You who are listening, have you ever witnessed injustice? In a workplace, in a classroom, on the street, in a store? Did you stay silent, or did you speak? Because silence protects the powerful, but voice protects the vulnerable. And every time you choose to speak, you change the ending of someone else's story. The screen faded to black. Her words lingered like an echo. And the lesson was clear. The Harringtons left behind a redemption arc. Naomi Carter left behind a legacy. And we are left with a choice. If this story moved you, don't just let it end here. Think about the moments in your own life, when you've seen someone treated unfairly, when you've felt the silence press in. Will you stay quiet, or will you choose to speak? If you believe in stories that remind us dignity matters more than wealth, join us here at Black Voice Matter. Subscribe, share, and be part of this community. A community that believes real power is kindness and true legacy is justice.